Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. I spoke with Daniel Simpson about his wonderful new book, The Truth of Yoga, a comprehensive guide to yoga's history, text, philosophy, and practices, just published by North Point Press. It's an easy read because Daniel is a professional writer, having left a burgeoning career in journalism after he became disillusioned with mainstream media. Our conversation dives deep into the complex and patchy history of yoga, swimming through early classical and hatha yoga, along with some interesting observations on modern yoga, including whether silent disco yoga is a thing. Kidding aside, this is a serious conversation, and I learned a great deal, especially just how fertile the soil was when the yogic traditions were taking hold and the creative cross-fertilization between classical yoga traditions and the Buddhists were happening at that time. This episode is a nice complement to our previous episode with Andrea Jain, whose book was a scholarly critique of modern global yoga. A little more about Daniel. Daniel Simpson teaches yoga philosophy at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies and at Tri-Yoga in London. He earned his master's degree from SOAS, the University of London, and his thesis, critiqued Mindfulness in Schools, was published in the journal Contemporary Buddhism. He previously worked as a foreign correspondent for Reuters, then the New York Times, after studying at Cambridge University. His interest in yoga developed in parallel, including frequent trips to India since the 1990s. I hope you buy his book, The Truth of Yoga. It's well written and researched, but accessible in a quick read. Please enjoy this episode. I know I did. Well, I'm happy to welcome Daniel Simpson to the Mindful Cranks. Daniel is a friend and a colleague, and he just published a new book called The Truth of Yoga, a comprehensive guide to yoga's history, text, philosophy, and practices, published by North Point Press. So, welcome, Daniel.
Oh, thanks, Ron. Great to be here. Nice to have a chat.
Yeah, I was reflecting in my mind the other day. I can't really recall how we first came into contact. Maybe you do, but I remember we first met briefly at a hotel in London in the summer of 2016.
Exactly. Yeah, I was researching my master's thesis on the subject of teaching mindfulness in schools, and I'd read some of your scholarly articles, about sort of critical perspectives on mindfulness. And although I'd gone into writing about mindfulness teaching in schools with a fairly open mind, I was, certainly struck by many of the points you were making and found them quite compelling. And I wanted to ask you a few questions, and it suddenly turned out you were in the UK, so the easiest way to do that was face-to-face, and it all went from there, I guess.
Yeah. And for full disclosure, I want to mention that Daniel is an amazing developmental editor, and he was the developmental editor for my book on mindfulness, which was published by Repeater Books in London and Penguin Random House in the U.S. So we'll talk more about your journalistic background, and before we dive into the book,
Sure.
Maybe we could start there. You had quite a career as a journalist before doing what you do now.
I mean, yeah, it's been a rich and varied life, some might say, or my father might shake his head and say I've taken a lot of wrong turns. I started out as a young trainee foreign correspondent at Reuters in the late 1990s, and then I was posted to various bureaus in Europe and out of Eastern Europe, where I was reporting for Reuters from Romania. I wound up in Macedonia in the former Yugoslavia, which got me a job with the New York Times covering the Balkans, and that turned into a real eye-opening experience, sitting on the sidelines, supposedly having a job to do, but they just were not interested after 9/11 in pretty much any news that wasn't about the war on terror. And I was increasingly encouraged in a way to invent angles related to that from where I was. The US Embassy in Belgrade at one point tried to get me sucked into a story about Serbia selling weapons of mass destruction delivery systems to Saddam Hussein. And all of that blew my mind, to be honest. And, I
Wow.
threw all my toys out the pram, chucked away my job, organized a music festival, got into terrible trouble. And things
So
kind of went a bit wayward. And that's what got me into yoga. It's a sort of segue
so
back
you
to the main topic.
so you were a war correspondent basically for the New York Times stationed there. Is that right?
I mean, that's probably overstating it a little. I was in
Oh,
formal
okay.
war zones, really. I mean, the brief skirmish in Macedonia in 2001 probably doesn't really count as a war, but certainly I got a taste of it. And there were all these correspondents who'd been hanging around the Balkans for the previous decade who were there at that time. And this was the summer of 2001, and within 3 months they were all in Afghanistan. And that's what got me hired. There was suddenly an exodus of all of these established people, and I guess I had this desire to follow them. I would rather have been doing that high profile job, but the fact that I wasn't, in fact, it gave me a real window on what was wrong with the media. To be honest, journalists want to be the center of attention. They want to be
Yeah.
where the news is, and they want to be saying, "Look at me, I know stuff." And
Yeah.
I was that way. Of course, I was an arrogant young man, and thought I knew things, even though I barely spoke the languages of the countries I was living in. And the fact that I wasn't doing that, and I was watching some of the nonsense that people were churning out, because that was it's just how the system works. Sometimes it's required to emphasize certain angles, otherwise you're suddenly not in favor and not in print. And I just couldn't believe it, and I tried to talk to my colleagues about it, and they didn't want to talk about it. They in fact accused me of being cynical or a conspiracy theorist, and this stuff was blindingly obvious to anti-war activists. The internet was full of, very clear examples of the holes in the argument being put forward for going to war. But I just couldn't find intelligent, educated, storied correspondents who were prepared to talk about that honestly, and perhaps their role, in fact, in making it more likely to go ahead. So that just blew my mind, and I realized, as I say, in a way, the problem of self-centeredness, and I guess that's there in every career. Everybody's trying to get ahead, and there are certain toes it pays not to tread on, and I seem to have made it my business to tread on as many of those toes as I can. And that's led me into difficult situations over my life. But I think it's taught me a lot about how difficult it is to tell the truth, to be honest. And there's a reason the word truth has cropped up in the title of my yoga book. I'm interested in trying to get to the truth, but I'm under no illusions about that being an easy task, in any way,
that
shape, or form.
that's interesting. I actually jotted down on my notes the truth of yoga, and I said that's a really bold title.
Well, it
I
actually
don't.
came out of the converse. At one point, I wanted to write a book that was titled "Yoga Without the Bullshit," because it seemed to me that most modern yoga was some sort of confection of, I don't know, prosperity gospel, crystal channeling, and
Yeah.
new age fantasies rather than actually ancient yoga philosophy. But my girlfriend at the time thankfully persuaded me to be a bit more positive.
Yeah, and you remind me in some ways of another person who I admire is Chris Hedges, who out of principle resigned from the New York Times when he spoke out against the Iraq War at a commencement speech at Rockford College in Illinois, and he was reprimanded and basically walked away from a 15-year career and left his pension and everything.
No, it's a very interesting, case to cite, Ron. To be honest, he's one of the few people I could have made contact with who would have had a on the level conversation with me, probably. I didn't really know that at the time, despite the fact that he'd been one of the New York Times Balkan correspondents. The woman I worked with as a translator used to work with him and was actually editing at the time I was working with his book about war. So, in some ways, there was a missed opportunity. I sometimes wonder if I'd had a sort of older, wiser mentor, if I might have seen past my youthful exuberance and anger and carried on being a reporter. But to be honest, I think if I'd spoken to him, he would have told me to do what he was doing, get the hell out. But it might have turned me into more of an alternative media correspondent. I think then, my ego really did kick in. I found it hard to stomach the idea of writing for free on the internet, having had a nice fat salary and, a career at the New York Times opening up in front of me. So I got into a bit of a dead end of, ranting in internet forums and writing my own blogs, but struggling to see the point of, spending money and spending time doing, the hard work of reporting. And that's even now, that's still lacking in a lot of alternative media. There's a lot of commentary, but to actually go out and do that hard work, and that's something that Chris has continued to do, I think, as well as, he's an opinionated guy and he likes to share his opinions, but he does get out and see things. And
he's on the ground. He does that investigative journalism, and he's one of the few. And so, Daniel, tell us then, perhaps a good pivot point. How did you first discover yoga, and how you came to be a serious student, practitioner, and even later a scholar of yoga?
Well, yeah, it's a long and meandering story like the others, I suppose. I mean, before I became a journalist, the summer before I started as a graduate trainee at Reuters, I had an advance on my salary that was supposed to help me get an apartment in London and buy a suit and get ready to show up to work. And I spent it instead on going to India and just doing the usual backpacker thing, hanging out, having a fun time. And I wound up spending some time with some very strange and interesting characters who people were talking of as yogis. And they're also perhaps more commonly known as sadhus, semi-naked, dreadlocked, wild men. There are a few women, but it's predominantly men. Sitting around fires, renouncing possessions, renouncing conventional life, at least for a time. Some of them are a little bit part-timer, but there were others who I got sort of quite close to spending time with. Really, that's their life. That's what they do, and that's as I came to realize when I studied this stuff properly later in my life. That's as far as we can see where yoga came from, where early Buddhism came from. This sort of original root of trying to deal with the problem of karma through an attempt to shut things down, to step away from all of these sources of distraction, and ultimately, mental confusion. And there are various forms, some of them physical, some of them mental, some meditative, some brutally ascetic, beating the body into submission. But they all had that same objective. And these guys, in some ways are a living legacy of that. But I kind of missed the point in those days. I was just, I guess, distracted by the fact that a lot of them sat around smoking hash all day long. And I found that quite appealing. And I guess I got confused between, what it was to get high and what it was to, see through my illusions. So in a way, my earliest illusion was that getting stoned might get me enlightened. And as I went through my New York Times meltdown, I smoked more and more. That gave me the crazy idea to run a music festival in the former Yugoslavia, and eventually the sort of the chaos that led to took me into a regular yoga class. I dabbled in a little bit of yoga, a little bit of meditation, but 2003 I came back to the UK very confused, and somebody suggested, why don't you go to this postural yoga class? It'll help. You'll feel a little bit less anxious, a little bit less depressed. And they were right. And suddenly I realized there was this thing I could do with my mind and my body that involved, in a weird way, a mixture of doing and not doing. And I was fascinated, but nobody seemed very capable of explaining it. Like my teachers would refer me to yoga texts, and then I would go and try and read them, and they would talk about all sorts of abstract philosophical things that had nothing to do with stretching on mats in a room with 30 other people. So I guess there was that seed planted very early on of there are questions that I can't find answers to. And also this sort of other memory of 5 years prior, I'd been hanging out with these wild men. I'd been back to India a couple of times. I'd been to this gathering of the wild yogis, the Kumbh Mela that takes place, every 12 years is the big one. And I went to the big one in 2001. And it's what led to the music festival idea. I thought, I'm going to have a gathering of 10 million people on the confluence of two rivers in the Balkans. But leaving that aside, now I just could see all these threads. And, ultimately the quest of all of these traditions in a way is to see through illusions. And I realized that the world of illusions had really infected the milieu in which I'd been working, the media, and I wanted answers. I wondered if there was some way in which meditative discipline or yogic practices could be some sort of tool for, I guess, mass awakening. I had a lot of naive assumptions, and I wanted to understand how these things worked and to try and teach them, and then perhaps to somehow marry the two worlds. I was at that time, sort of on the fringes of a British media criticism website called Media Lens, and the two guys who run that, they're a couple of sort of Chomsky fans, and they were big into Buddhism, and I liked the way that they combined these two ideas, and I sort of thought I could do something with that. But it was very hard, I think, to find anything to read that would explain all of this to me back in those days. I could find books by yoga teachers that were, by and large, sort of self-improvement texts or instructional manuals, or I could find, they were very difficult to find, but people pointed me towards more academic writing in really a handful of books that were available at that time that were impenetrable to me, even with a good education, because I just didn't have the background knowledge. There were so many footnotes and so many arcane references to things that I didn't understand because I didn't have the sort of the preliminary grounding. And so what I've wound up doing is writing the book I wanted to read in 2004 when I first started trying to find one that was just, here's an authoritative overview of basically all the stuff that people know about the history and philosophy of yoga. Clearly, in the space of a couple hundred pages, it's not going to be an encyclopedia, but it should hopefully be enough of a starting point that you could then reach for anything specialist in any of those fields and feel like you've got some sort of starting spot.
Yeah, I really liked how you organized the book and broke it down into early yoga, classic yoga, hatha yoga, modern yoga, and some other themes that came up as well. Before we move further into the book, I'd like to circle back to your training. Is eventually you ended up at SOAS in London, and could you say something about that? It's quite a historical place in terms of the study of Asian religions.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's also got its other strange history as a kind of training ground for British colonial officials and perhaps spies as well. But I mean, I guess over the years, between 2004 2014, I was getting more and more serious about my yoga practice, but I hadn't found a way to answer those questions. And even spending a lot of time in India, I would find that I was being shown a very small part of the yoga tradition by some guru or one teacher or another, or a friend who had a bit more knowledge than me. And they were always sort of talking as if that was the whole world. But then I would find somebody else who would tell me something different that was also the whole world. So I was drawn in the end to, the idea of some sort of Western scholarly rigor that might, give me a bit of objective detachment and enable me to see, how to find some sort of umbrella I could erect over all of these, the whole world, because there seemed to be by that stage a couple of dozen of them, different philosophies, different traditions really of interpreting yoga philosophy. So at that time, SOAS was going through a bit of a restructuring process, and they just started this MA program that they called Traditions of Yoga and Meditation. And originally, I think, it partly came into being because there were yoga teachers like me who wanted to know more, and also because there were religious studies professors, who found there weren't that many students interested in what they had to offer, and yet what they wanted to talk about was exactly what the yoga teachers felt clueless about. For a start, the Vedic traditions of India, which a lot of people say yoga comes from, although it's questionable when you start to look in depth, or some of the comparative studies of these early renouncer traditions, whether they're Buddhists, Jains, or what we would now think of as Hindus, or even people who have no religion whatsoever. And both of those disciplines were actually well covered at SOAS because of that traditional specialization. The acronym stands for School of Oriental and African Studies. So pretty much what it says on the cover. They teach Sanskrit, for example. So I was fortunate enough to start what remains a fairly rudimentary grasp of the Sanskrit language, but also to have access to people who really knew what they were talking about, and also had that sort of critical distance, which in the end I found a little bit too critical, a little too distant for my own taste, because I'm a practitioner really. I'm not a scholar in the end. I like using scholarly methods to put things on a fairly stable basis, evidence-based argument, but in the end, I want to put this stuff into practice. I'm not sort of looking at it under a magnifying glass as another weird thing that humans get up to. And in some ways, I think the academic approach to these disciplines inevitably winds up down that alleyway.
Well, maybe it's a good point to talk just briefly about early yoga. And from what I read, there are sort of some threads going back to the Vedas, but certainly not anything to do with postural yoga. But I was struck by the significance given to speech and language in the Vedas, and what was that all about in your assessment?
Well, yeah, I mean that's really an explanation of the origins of everything in a way. That I mean, there are various stories of creation in Hindu tradition, and in some ways, for them to be expressed, language is a precondition. And there was this history of really very rational and intellectual analysis of the foundation for being able to say anything at all. And I think the sort of intellectual curiosity of some of those early Vedic priests who gave us some of the later Vedic texts, the Brahmanas, commentaries on the ritual that sort of evolved into the Aranyakas and the Upanishads, where we start to get philosophy and even the first teachings on something that's actually identified as yoga. They were asking pretty searching questions, and there are all of these theories about what comes first and what's the foundation for everything else, and eventually that sort of becomes this philosophy of Brahman, the underpinning of everything. But there are many candidates for that as well. At different times, breath was put forward, and speech as well. And there are debates in which relative merits of all these different candidates are thrashed out. I think there's one very famous debate in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad where a sage Yajnavalkya is trying to sort of explain the foundation of everything, and there's this very inquisitive and quite argumentative female renunciate, a rare example of a female being featured. Her name is Gargi, and she asks pretty searching questions and keeps saying, yeah, but what's behind that? No, but never mind that, what's behind that? And in the end he gets one up on her, but that's the sort of spirit of it. And I think language is deemed to be sacred as part of that process, the attempt to explain the source of all without doing so in this sort of linear way. And it's very similar sort of to the physics, sort of explanation of how we come from singularity to multiplicity. But it's not really possible to say what came before the Big Bang.
So yeah, that's very interesting.
So speech therefore must be sacred if it's in some way able to engage in that. And the mantras that made the ritual happen for the Vedic priests were, of course, the essence of holiness. Without them being uttered, there would be no possibility of asking the gods for conditions that sustained life.
The Om mantra being the classic seed syllable, right? Where the whole world is emanating.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's a perfect example of how the two get combined. Of how this sort of sanctity of language and the idea of there sort of being a condensed essence out of which everything grows. Yeah. Exactly.
I think you even trace the etymology of going to omni in Latin, like omnipresent, om, or all. Is that right?
Well, I was suggesting that that's a good way of thinking about it. I mean, it's very hard to know with these old. Yes, again, scholars like to speak very assertively about what they know, but then 10 years later they've completely revised their thesis. There's a lot of linguistic, hypotheses, I think, about the origins of what we now know as the Indo-European language families. And again, I'm no expert in this at all, but from my studies, it's become clearer and clearer to me that, firstly, as some people would argue in India today, Sanskrit is the oldest language. That's not true. However, there is something from which Sanskrit emerged that is also the root of modern Indo-European languages, all but a couple of languages spoken in Europe, pretty much. So there is some sort of shared ancestry, but nobody really knows what it was, and they've called it Proto-Indo-European. It's got a typically scholarly name. And then there are all these theories about how words are cognate with one another, and hypothesized connections. But it's very clear that there, certainly once you get to Latin and Greek, which seem to have derived from these sources, that we can see the absolute direct connection to English, for example. And So I was just sort of noting that there are many ways in which these words are familiar to us, even if there isn't actually an intended connection in the derivation, the etymology, strictly speaking. It's instructive how similar two apparently very different cultures are.
I was kind of intrigued when you unpacked it a bit further, though, when you were looking at the Om mantra, because it is kind of phonetically AUM, and you connected each letter with a particular configuration that, let's see, A was associated with mentality that clouds perception like a dream. And then dreamless sleep, was that something that you recall? I found that kind of intriguing, and given my interest in dream yoga, and also what came up for me a lot in the book is how these trinities, how they turn up all the time, these holy trinities, right?
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Like generation, organization, and destruction, a trimurti.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, those, I can't possibly take credit for that, unfortunately. That comes from the Mandukya Upanishad, and it's really the foundations of Advaita Vedanta, the sort of philosophy that in some ways is similar to Buddhism. In fact, Shankara, the sort of foremost sort of theologian or scholar of Advaita Vedanta, was accused of being a Buddhist. And the teacher of his teacher, as the tradition would have it, a guy called Gaudapada, was definitely accused of being a Buddhist, although in his commentary on the Mandukya Upanishad, he does say this is not Buddhist. So he was obviously aware of the similarity and was still trying to distinguish it. But the point was really that, somewhere, the distinction obviously clearly between Buddhism and the Vedantic worldview is the idea of a permanent self, or the absence of a permanent self. But once you get over that hurdle, a lot of similarities exist. And the description there was to do with the ultimate state being beyond conventional perception, and being beyond this world in which we're going about day by day, blind to the interconnectedness of things. And that's the sort of first level, and that's equated with that first syllable, the first phoneme, really, of the syllable Om. And then there's a state of dreaming, which is the same. We're caught up in illusions, except, only a fool would confuse his dreams with reality, or somebody who's very into their dream. And yet, at the same time, obviously, there's that you can flip that on its head, as you've noted, and think about dream yoga and say, well, we live in the world and we have to function in the world, and so although it's perhaps not the highest state, there are two truths: there's the relative truth and the absolute truth. And so, you can bring that same sort of degree of agency into dream. But then beyond there is the state of deep dreamless sleep, where the mind is basically, to all intents and purposes, shut down. The only difference between that and the sort of transcendent state is that there's not really any awareness of it. There is some sort of background awareness, and this is used as a sort of foundational argument for the sort of primacy of consciousness, that something is aware of you having been in a deep sleep, even though you weren't sort of awake in it.
Do they refer to that as the bhavanga?
Well, no, but
no.
Yeah, there was a similar idea. Yeah, so that's obviously coming up in the commentarial traditions of early Buddhism. Yeah, and there is this close parallel, I think, between those two developments. Obviously, these guys were talking to each other and were talking about the same sorts of things. But the difference being in the Vedanta worldview is there's a state beyond that where there's nothing going on in the mind, and that's this transcendent state, and it's timeless and it's eternal, and it's the Atman, it's beyond.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the cross-fertilization and between Buddhist and yogis. It's remarkable. When I was reading your book, it was almost like you couldn't differentiate.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, this is, again, a great benefit. I mean, I really do have to say, I've brought my journalism skills to bear and just summed up what other people have, with great commitment, spent 20 years researching, or longer in some cases. It's whole lifetimes of scholarship that I've distilled into 500-word summaries. But yeah, I mean, this is really one of the sort of breakthrough realizations, I think, of the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, there's always been theories about how certain texts or certain traditions had some crossover, but it seems now just beyond doubt, and presented in this way, that there is just some sort of commonality of renouncer traditions, that what we know of as yoga must have in some way originated there. It might not be the only place it originated, but it's so different to what went before it in the Vedic world that even if it came from some guys on the fringes of Vedic culture, they'd basically been booted out of the mainstream or had removed themselves to such an extent that they were the same thing as these other guys anyway. This whole problem of karma, this question of how to resolve this thing that Vedic ritual doesn't even see as a problem. Vedic ritual sees action as fundamentally effective. It has to be performed correctly, and then the gods will provide. Whereas there suddenly becomes this theorization. Hang on, all these actions create consequences that spiral us forwards, never ending in this cycle. And so that crossover of between Buddhists, Jains, as I say, and yogis, it's scholarly research now has established very clearly, I think, that they have so much in common that they probably didn't even differentiate themselves until later. The isms that we attach to them.
Yeah, the isms, right? Like Hinduism was a term actually the Persians used, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, they really just called people who lived in India Hindu. So, in some ways, modern Hindu nationalism isn't exactly aberrant. It's talking in the old language, except it's now excluding as the rightful citizens of India all people who wouldn't identify as adherents of the Hindu religion. And suggesting if you're not prepared to sign up to certain tenets of that, or at least have other people say that those things need to be taught in school, then you don't really have a place there. But yeah, you're right. These distinctions are relatively recent, and I mean, I think obviously the schools of different philosophy were arguing with each other, and their debates, I think, are very instructive. It seems that. Just one quick thing. It seems that people won debates by proving they understood each other's points, and therefore had to engage very, very deeply with these other points of view. And I think that's probably why so many of them get borrowed.
I even heard there were scholars that even wrote like rules for engagement of such debates, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's a whole philosophy of Nyaya, which develops this sort of theory of logic by which constructive disagreements can be had. And I think,
well, that's not like what we're doing now, is it?
Well, that's why I bring it up. I mean, there's just so much binary tribalism, considering how advanced we seem to think of ourselves as a society. When it comes to communication, we've got a lot to learn, I think, from the ancient past.
The classical yoga chapter was really fascinating to me, and what really stood out for me, not just in this chapter, but in some of the others, is just how much yoga was seen and defined as meditation, and really that its ultimate aim was, spiritual liberation. But as we move into this period, you bring up a text, Mahabharata. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Mahabharata, yeah.
Mahabharata, which is deemed as the oldest yoga manual. Is that something you discovered?
Yeah, well, I mean, another of the great sort of breakthroughs for me was seeing some of these connections, and I guess scholars are always, I mean, it's inevitable and it's important. And I'm talking to you. You're a scholar as well, but I think like me, you also stand a little bit outside of it. You wrote Mindfulness not as very, very deliberately, not as a scholarly book to make it accessible. And I think there's a place for the precision required in scholarly language, but the problem with it is that it sees distinction everywhere, and it becomes very difficult, therefore, to spot parallels, because there'll always be a reason for pointing out, the exceptions to those generalizations, and whole careers are built on that sort of thing. But it seemed more and more clear to me that throughout its history, there has been no distinction made between yoga and meditation. And in fact, two of the foremost scholars of yoga history whose work has been very influential on me, who were both teaching at SOAS when I was studying there, Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton, they wrote a book, Roots of Yoga, that came out about 4 years ago now. And, it's it's a wonderful collection of source material, but it's a very dense read for the average yoga teacher. And I guess that was the final sort of kick up the backside to me to try and synthesize all the stuff I've been filling my hard drive with. But in there, they point this out. I mean, for a modern yoga teacher, there's a distinction between yoga and meditation, even if they themselves practice what they would think of as both disciplines. But for the history of yoga, there's really never been a distinction between the two things. Yoga was meditation until very, very recently. And even when postural yoga of a sort, doing things with the body other than sitting down, or beating it into submission with weird stuff like holding your arm above your head forever, or standing on one leg until it becomes an unusable tree trunk. Even then, that's always introduced as a prelude to meditation. It's something to do with the body to make it easier to sit, or to do more funky, energetic things involving breath work and visualization.
And in this chapter, you do also point out sort of like the shift, in a way, how yoga kind of slowly began to shift more into worldly terms with karma yoga. In other words, moving away from the extreme of non-action or asceticism. And you bring up the Bhagavad Gita and of course, Krishna.
Yes.
Was that kind of a pivot point for yoga historically, do you think?
I mean, it's really, for us in the modern era, it's about the only thing left to hold on to. Because, when it comes down to it, modern yoga teachers are often talking about what they teach in terms of the philosophy of Patanjali and his Yoga Sutra. And his Yoga Sutra was probably written in about the 4th, 5th century of the Common Era, summarizing what had been taught for 1,000 years previously, including a lot of the ideas of early Buddhist meditation. And it's an ascetic text. It's a text about how to shut down the mind and disappear and renounce the world. And most descriptions of liberation in yoga, even as recently as 500 years ago, still speak in the same way of it being like a piece of wood, or apparently dead while still awake, and just disappeared, gone beyond. And the Mahabharata, in which the Bhagavad Gita is contained, has a similar compendium of teachings to Patanjali, but it's earlier, and it also is concerned with worldly action. I mean, it's a narrative story about war, basically, 100,000 verses on a family that goes to war with itself. And the Bhagavad Gita comes in the middle of it, on the eve of the battle, the cataclysmic showdown between good and evil. And in the sort of middle of these two lined up armies, the deity Krishna descends. He's been there all along, but he happens to be the supreme being as well as the chariot driver of one of these soldiers, and starts dispensing teachings on yoga. But they're allied to the idea of, you better get on with it. This soldier doesn't want to fight. He doesn't want to slaughter his relatives. And out of that comes a philosophy of action. And a lot of that seems to have been inspired, I think, by the Buddhist compromise, perhaps, between asceticism and worldliness, that still, is austere and monastic in its early forms, but enables the evolution of a middle way. And yoga didn't really have that same development, except through the more religious tradition that grew out of the Bhagavad Gita, the practice of devotional worship, really. Because in the end, although Krishna talks about all sorts of forms of yoga, his ultimate teaching is devotional surrender to the deity, and offering up everything to God, and then just getting on with it with no attachment to what happens, and trusting in a way that it'll all be okay. And so on the one hand, while it's talking about worldly action, and it's about the only ancient yoga text that we can reach back to that does talk about worldly action, it's got all these problems for us. It's set in a war zone, and its basic philosophy is get on with the fight. It's all about God, and to modern practitioners, those are things that don't sound that appealing. So it's somehow not the handhold that it might be. And I think there's a reason that when a lot of people in the modern era get more into meditation, and also are looking for a worldlier spin on Dharma traditions, they're drawn to Buddhism, because those things are so much more clearly enunciated there. And there's also a longer history of a Western variant that's produced its own texts. In the yoga sphere, that just hasn't happened. All we've got is this creative pretense that Patanjali is talking about postural yoga, or attempts to sell crystals and chakra balancing workshops, and there's very little about modern philosophies of engagement with social reality. allied to some of the Dharma principles behind them, as there is in engaged Buddhism, for example. And there isn't really, the sort of complicated and intricate manuals of meditational practice that there are in Abhidharma Buddhism, for example. Some of that creeps into Patanjali and is sort of there, but there's very little in the way of instruction. And so it's very hard to actually practice yoga meditation. There's not really any guidelines. Focus on an object until you're very good at it.
Yeah, I mean, the compendium, it's just vast in the Buddhist literature in terms of systematic manuals and commentaries in so many different, especially in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, right?
Absolutely.
It's phenomenal. But as I look at classical yoga in your research from the book, all of the key kind of philosophical tenets seem to be occurring during that period, right? Karma, kleshas, dukkha, dharma, all of these essential sort of philosophical systems were kind of being generated during this period. Is that your sense?
Yeah, I think a lot of it even predates that. It's coming right back from that earliest sort of late Vedic period, the emergence of this idea of karma and the need to find a solution, and therefore this polarity between sukha and dukkha, the suffering and attempts to resolve it, and ultimately, some attempts to transcend that duality, going beyond pain and pleasure, and to find a steady state that can just sort of glide through without being pulled in either direction. And all these practices seem to be aiming towards that. And that's there. It's established 2,500 years ago, I think. What's lacking are articulations of techniques and ways in which this philosophy relates to a worldly life. And for modern practitioners, it's quite confronting, I think, as I discovered for myself nearly 20 years ago when I started trying to read these texts, because there's just no connection made. And I haven't in my book tried to suggest that there's an easy connection that we can make, because we probably have to acknowledge that we're not looking to avoid rebirth as our number one priority for stepping into a postural yoga class, or even necessarily believing that's how reality configures itself. So as soon as we're going to start rearranging teachings to suit our worldview in 21st century Western societies, we're changing things, and that's fine. But people aren't very keen to do that publicly, or to acknowledge even that needs to be done. There's an attempt to sort of cherry pick the bits that sound appealing, and then say that that's what the original text said, and they don't say that at all. They talk about a project of stopping existence, transcending, and the same idea can be accessed in other ways. And there's a whole thing we haven't really got into yet, but I think, having heard what you just said about Tantric Buddhism, I think we should mention it, though. It's, the philosophy of Tantra is enormously influential in giving an ingredient for a different relationship with the body. Instead of having to see the body as the source of the obstacle through its attachment to sensory pleasures, and therefore the solution being shut down all engagement with the world, there's a subtler way of relating both to engagement with sensory pleasures and ultimately to the body itself. Body can be transformed rather than transcended. And that's the key ingredient that leads to the sort of next 1,000 years of evolution towards postural yoga in the present. But it's still a very different thing, and it's got its own religious worldview in the Hindu context. There's deities involved.
Yeah, and it seems like yoga's central aim, at least during this classical period that you're talking about, was ways to rewind perception to its source, I think is how you put it.
That's it, yeah. That is the common thread, yeah.
Yeah. I also like, just to pick up on a few tidbits here, is that it's interesting because you translate, or at least you've seen a translation of dukkha, obviously in Buddhist traditions, roughly translates as suffering or unsatisfactoriness. But you have a term or a phrase translating it as bad space. And that's really interesting because I was reading a book by the late Stephen Goodman, who is a Buddhist scholar, on the Abhidharma. And he translated some Tibetan term for dukkha as crowded space. And I found that really fascinating, this idea of how our mental space is kind of crowded or obscured. And then you bring up this notion of citta vritti, the turning of thoughts. Is that like the turning of conceptuality in the mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's the cogs of cognition spinning
Yes.
around, basically. Yeah.
And I think they're all related in that sense. But yeah, bringing up tantras, that was really how you connected it actually to the original kind of meaning of hatha. You kind of linked it to the early understanding of hatha yoga, and just to say that hatha was a term that meant stubbornness or force.
Yeah, that's its literal meaning in Sanskrit. Although, in some ways, the tradition that we know of as hatha yoga is subtler than that. It uses very powerful techniques to do something quite forceful to the body, but tries to apply them in careful and gradual ways. Otherwise, it warns in the Hatha Pradipika that if you do pranayama in any other way than the same way that you go about taming a lion, it'll kill you. So you need to exert that degree of caution and step by step carefulness in your approach.
But the tantric traditions that you bring up, that's really a shift to this notion of the mystical body and the embodiment of awakening, and exactly. The various techniques to tap into whether it's transmutation of the energies in the body or subtle channels, the winds, the drops, the nadis, all kundalini, whatever it may be. What was most significant for you during this kind of phase of the research that you were diving into here with the tantric resonance to yoga?
I mean, that for me has been the biggest area of learning, I suppose.
Yeah.
Such a vast range of texts and traditions under that umbrella, and I'm really a novice when it comes to the tantras themselves. I know more about how they relate to physical yoga and some of the teachings that have been drawn from tantric traditions, all of those that you just mentioned, for example. But their original ritual function within the tantras themselves was very structured and very detailed. And going from text to text, there are different ways of installing things in the body. And I think this is the biggest contrast in some ways to what you were just highlighting earlier. A lot of early yoga was purely about rewinding perception to its source, in that sense of just trying to, the whole philosophy of Samkhya, on which the early yoga teachings tend to be based.
Kind of withdrawing into consciousness and kind of just disappearing, right?
Exactly, yeah. It's dismantling the building blocks of life, understanding how it's all made up of these parts and seeing beyond them and then having nothing more to do with them. Whereas the tantric view is, well, all these parts can be played with. They can be rearranged. They can do funky things. And ultimately, the aim is still to get beyond, the confusion in the mind.
Kind of an alchemy, right? Of sorts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You can heat up the crucible of the body, and all manner of whiz-bang fireworks can go off in the process of actually shutting down the mind. So the end state's the same: go beyond the mind, but you don't have to do this sort of weird, austere disappearing act. I mean, there's tantric traditions that go to the opposite extreme. Obviously, there's all manner of hedonistic, orgiastic.
That's the wild yogi kind of archetype.
There's some continuity between some of those characters who I encountered in India and some of these tantric traditions. Some of the particular Agori naked sadhus who live in cremation grounds, and Buddhist tantric traditions also have some. Echo of this tendency, but I think for the physical yoga practice, all of those different possibilities became embodied. So even if it's tantric sex and the ritual mingling of different fluids as an offering to a deity, is something that one can create within one's own body. So all these polarities. In fact, this is probably one of the most interesting things. It's often said today yoga means union, but really no texts talk about yoga meaning union and until you get this sort of tantric spin on things. There's also the Vedanta flavor of Atman and Brahman not being different, the oneness of everything. So yoga is union in that sense. But the early texts about yoga practice weren't using that philosophy. They were talking about, as we just rewinding everything. And suddenly you get with tantric philosophy the idea of, there's things to be balanced, whether it's flows of energy, whether it's the raising of something powerful up the spine to dissolve the mind, and therefore uniting energy and consciousness in some sort of transcendent explosion. There's this polarity that's transcended. And it's said in one of the medieval yoga texts, the Yoga Bija, therefore, yoga is the union of all dualities. Any possible polarity that you can transcend is yoga. So, it does come from a Sanskrit root that means joining things, but it also has a subtler, the meaning of concentration. And yoga as concentration is the early history. This union of energetic forces is what gives us this sort of shift into the realm.
Yeah, I think the term samadhi doesn't mean like gathering together.
Pretty much, yeah, putting together, exactly, yeah. And often, it's used, in my limited understanding, in a Buddhist context, perhaps more in relation to something that's done. So as a practice, as much as the outcome of the practice. And in the yoga connotation, largely due to Patanjali, it's thought of as a state rather than what's being done. But really, Patanjali's first sutra, there's the commentary that accompanies it. This is another thing that yoga scholarship has established really beyond doubt, I think, in the last 20 years, is that the Yoga Sutras, 195 very terse aphorisms, shorter than a newspaper feature in total. I think there's about 3 verbs in there as well. So very, very, very dense and difficult to interpret. So modern readers get that and think, well, okay, I'll read into it whatever helps me make sense of it, or relates to my experience, or sounds like what I wished it said. Whereas there's an original commentary that goes with it that's like detailed footnotes clarifying what's meant in terms of the tradition that Patanjali was writing in. And the footnote to the very first sutra says yoga is samadhi. That's it, sort of one sentence, yoga samadhi. That's it.
Wow.
That's all there is. So it's the practice and the outcome of the practice involving putting everything together. So the yoking is just a concentrated mind. Fix your mind on an object until you're so good at that you don't need an object. That's really all Patanjali has to say. Whereas the tantric traditions bring in all sorts of other things one can do to get to that more difficult attainment of transcending the mind. Patanjali just like, sit down, switch your mind off. Yeah, great. Cool. How?
And I found that asana was really meditation, sitting. It wasn't about postures, right? I mean, that was the original meaning.
It just means seat. It comes from the verb root as, which means to sit. So it's a thing that you sit on, or a position you adopt to sit down. Yeah, it's meant that for most of its history. It's only with medieval texts on hatha yoga that the word gets used to putting the body in different positions, and then it's become associated with those non-seated positions. And these days, with moving between the contortions in fancy leggings on a mat.
And you point to an 11th century work, Amrita Siddhi, and you mentioned it may have been codified, the Hatha Yoga teachings, by Buddhists. And is it around the 12th to the 15th century that we begin to see postures?
Yeah, it seems like probably the earliest teaching that we've found in text, or that scholars have found, 1,000 years ago, there was the arm balance Mayurasana, which is elbows in your abdomen and legs sticking out behind you, sort of like being a stick suspended on your forearms. And that's clearly something that you can't hold for very long. And all of the previous things that were taught were either to sit still for a very long time, or to adopt a very painful and difficult position, like keeping your arms above your head and never bringing them down. And suddenly there's these things that are clearly for some short-term benefit. I mean, we can hypothesize, certainly the description of Mayurasana in the most popular hatha text, the Hatha Pradipika, is it is good for your digestion. So stick your elbows in your gut, balance on it, it'll keep you regular. And therefore make it easier to do subtle energetic things. But originally that's come out of ascetic traditions, obviously with some modification of the asceticism to do something else. And that's sort of, the modification seems to have come from the world of Tantra. And it seems that there was such a crossover at that time between what we now know of as Tantric Buddhism and what we think of today as Hindu Shaiva traditions for the most part, that they were really doing the same thing, perhaps in different ways, in different languages, but still, for the most part, the same sort of project. And the earliest record, again, I'm drawing on the work here of Jim Mallinson and Jason Birch particularly. They've identified a couple dozen references in Buddhist sources to something called hatha yoga, and originally it was a technique of retaining your semen in sexual ritual. Most tantric sex, unlike the way it's taught today, wasn't about retaining your semen at all. It was about producing it and mixing it with menstrual blood and offering this funky cocktail to a ferocious deity. Anyway, coming back to physical yoga, it seems then that sort of codifications of other things that one could use that were this weird mixture of ascetic, body discipline and tantric philosophy of manipulation of subtle energies. Three techniques known as mudras, Mahamudra, Mahabandha, and Mahaveda. They're taught in this text, the Amrita Siddhi, which is it's a complicated tantric Buddhist text. But those three teachings are then adopted by all of the subsequent texts on physical yoga. And Jason Birch has identified a yoga text that seems to take them from the Amrita Siddhi and yogify them, as it were. So it's again this cross-pollination, cross-fertilization, and we see it. The same thing happening today. Ideas going backwards and forwards between East and West, and there's a whole thing about cultural appropriation and whatnot now. But cultural exchange has been the foundation of how yoga has evolved. Ideas coming and getting cross-fertilized from some other inspiration, and new things emerging from that. And it does seem, therefore, that the Buddhists were the first ones to write this stuff down. Whether they were the first to do it, we don't know. Whether they invented it, impossible to say. Seems unlikely, given that there's this prehistory of ascetic practice and an earlier description of doing an ascetic asana for some other reason that has nothing to do with the previous rationalizations. But it's lost. The problem is, Ron, we just don't know about most of the past. And the thing that scholars are reluctant to say very often, because it kind of devalues somehow their conclusions, is we're looking at the tip of the iceberg, making all sorts of educated guesses about what the whole iceberg looks like, and there's absolutely no way of seeing beneath the surface. We just don't know. It's all lost oral traditions from 2,000 years ago. We just can't find. We've got no way of knowing, so we're guessing a lot of the time.
Maybe this is a good time then to turn our attention to more recent history, modern yoga. And I actually studied and practiced some form of hatha yoga through a mail order course that I had. This is way before the internet and everything. In 1979, I was a freshman in college. I remember I had a little 3-ring binder, and I can't remember the name of it now. And then later, I took up the practice of Tibetan yoga, or Kumni, which was quite rich, but that's another story. But you trace the first commercialized form of yoga, modern yoga, back to 1918 in Mumbai, India.
Well, again, this is just sort of reaching into the available source material and jumping to conclusions. But that's
okay. It's a good story, though.
That's the earliest record we have of somebody talking about gathering together a bunch of urban middle class people for a gentle stretch and relaxation session. And really, before that, we have to assume, from the way that the texts are written, and from the way that people talk about yogis outside of the yoga world, that yoga was taught orally from a guru to an initiated student. And it was largely to be practiced by yourself. And the whole idea of sequencing postures to be practiced in a group is a very modern thing, and probably was influenced by other forms of group exercise. But again, that's we can't prove. But
I'd like to get into that. But who is this figure that you bring up? Krishnamacharya?
Krishnamacharya, yeah, he's probably the most influential of the innovators of early 20th century India. The other guy who taught that first class, Yogendra, is another one. Kuvalayananda, who was a contemporary of Yogendra's, had the same guru. And I think I mentioned them more just to say that although Krishnamacharya is incredibly influential because of his students more than anything else, BKS Iyengar in particular, and Patabi Joyce, whose two systems, Iyengar Yoga and Ashtanga Yoga, are really the foundation of most modern yoga classes. Detailed instructions for doing stuff with the body to try and get it into better alignment on the case of Iyengar, and with Pattabhi Joy's the innovation of sequenced flowing postures. Power yoga, vinyasa flow, that all comes from Ashtanga originally, and that all came from the teachings of Krishnamacharya. And like these other guys, he was just very creatively synthesizing, I think, and doing in some ways a wonderful job of marrying new ideas that really had nothing to do with the yoga tradition with yoga techniques. So
Yeah.
it became a new way of preserving some of these old teachings and making them more accessible.
I see a lot of parallels to what is called Buddhist modernism. So this is like yoga modernism. Because the British colonialists, right, were kind of snubbing yoga and really looked down upon it, right? Then they have kind of a really kind of condescending view of yoga as a bunch of crazy ascetics laying on a bed of nails, a bunch of freaks, and then was this kind of a
that was certainly the mainstream view, although I think
yeah.
kind of off duty and behind the scenes, there were quite a lot of colonialists who were quite inspired and I guess in the same way that I was, in the late 1990s, drawn to this weird world of, otherworldliness, people living outside of conventional norms, apparently harnessing some sort of magic powers almost, and, getting involved in strange things like smoking mind-boggling amounts of cannabis. And so there's a very influential figure I'm thinking of at this moment, which is why I'm bringing it up, a colonial era judge by the name of Sir John Woodruff, who used the pen name Arthur Avalon, who translated a 16th century tantric text or a sort of summary of earlier tantric teachings about chakras. And it's thanks to his work that we have this particular system of chakras that the world now thinks of as the chakras. They're just one of many, many possibilities with different names, different locations, different numbers. And that was because, at the same time as demonizing yogis, people were fascinated by them. There was this whole theosophical, esoteric, occult interest in the mystical teachings of the East.
This is the exotic East, right?
Yeah, exactly. That has all these, wonderful ways of attaining things that we don't have access to in the West. But by and large, though, yeah, I mean, yogis were demonized. They were thought weird and degenerate, and for also good reasons. They'd formed armies of mercenaries who'd been used to fight the British armies of mercenaries when the East India Company was trying to get itself established.
And Vivekananda, he was a very central figure in the modernization of yoga, but he was not a advocate of hatha yoga per se.
That's a very good point you bring up there, Ron. Yeah, a lot has been written about Vivekananda in the last 20 years by yoga scholars as if he is this pivot point. And he is in some ways, because I think the distinction I would make perhaps between this yoga modernism and Buddhist modernism, at least to the extent I've understood Buddhist modernism, is that this is happening. I mean, there's some of it goes on, I guess, in Asia, thinking, I suppose of the Burmese meditation movement to bring things to the laity in new language. There is that sort of similarity. But a lot of this was happening in India for very specific Indian reasons, but has seeded something that's, gone away and run off, on its whole new adventure. But Vivekananda was really the first to somehow tap into this East-West fascination and see the potential there to, in his eyes, I suppose, promote Hinduism, but to do so in a way that was very appealing to Westerners, and also to take from Western analysis of the world something that was very, very appealing to Indians. And he brought the whole idea of sort of, I guess, inspired to a certain extent by Christianity, of social work and uplifting the poor, and interpreting Vedanta in such a way as to sort of minimize caste distinctions and certainly discrimination against women. And he was a social reformer in that sense as well. And I think
he was like some of the Buddhists at the time that also had interactions with the Theosophical Society.
Sure, there's the Westerners being there, have this distorting influence on yoga history, and I think a lot of the frustrations articulated today by people who get animated about cultural appropriation or Western commodifiers of yoga, I mean, they're for very good reasons, sort of animated by some of the stuff that was done in the 19th century and the ways in which yoga formed itself through an interaction with colonial occupiers. And so even when there was an attempt to do something innovative on Indians' own terms for their own benefit, it was using a framework that was external to them in order to get validation in a way and acceptance, and ultimately get won over the occupying power and ideally remove them. And physical yoga was rehabilitated as a tool for doing that.
Well, it reminds me, I see a really interesting parallel, like in Burma that we were brought up earlier with Ledi Sayadaw opening up mindfulness or vipassana meditation to the masses, and the mass meditation movements is a kind of a way to preserve Buddhism and fight Christian missionaries and so forth. And it seems like something similar happened in India, where you talk about that hatha yoga, or the modernization of yoga, was happening within this context of national pride in physical exercise and gymnastics.
Yeah, again, I've really got to tip my hat to Mark Singleton, whose book Yoga Body came out just over 10 years ago, and made a lot of waves in the yoga world because it pointed these things out and effectively noted that such traditions as Ashtanga yoga were not as old as their practitioners might like to imagine, and that Krishnamacharya, the guy we talked about briefly earlier, had been very creatively mixing traditions of gymnastics with, or appeared to have been, certainly was operating in a context in which things that didn't seem traditionally yogic were being mixed together with yoga practices.
And those were...
Others were openly talking about it, whereas Krishnamacharya disguised it a bit.
And it was some influence from Sweden on these gymnastics or something?
Yes. I mean, well, this is really just because it was known at the time as physical culture, what we might today just call fitness, fitness culture, cultivating the body, but also with a sort of religious spin on it. It was, mind, body, spirit discipline. And this became popular as a way of training, first of all, school children, soldiers, imperial administrators in a way that would sort of make them fit and healthy. And it was promoted in India also to the natives. I mean, it was introduced in schools. It was also something that was around in the background. There were soldiers practicing these drills. So this system of gymnastics that originated in Sweden, also popularized by some Danes. It's not to say that yoga is Swedish gymnastics. It's more just the practice of these things was so prevalent. And there are some postures in modern yoga that don't seem to have any historical precedent, that look like shapes made in some of these gymnastic traditions. So although you can't prove a causal link, it's very striking. And I think really, though, it shifted, I guess, the focus to suggest that actually having a workout could be a spiritual thing. And that was an idea that was developed. I mean, Adolf Hitler said the same thing. You should build up the German stock through a sort of mind-body discipline, and that would be good for the body politic. I told an interviewer that in 1923. But this thing, it was always in some ways political, and in India at that time, the resistance against British occupation fused with the teaching of physical yoga with this idea of we're being ridiculed as effeminate weaklings by this occupying power. We have our own traditions of physical discipline that we can draw on. And there's a whole Indian martial arts tradition and wrestling traditions. And I think yoga had interacted with those to a certain extent beforehand to develop some of its more dynamic, strength-based postures. And I think all that happened was a continuation of that. And it became sort of uncomfortable for that to be acknowledged 10 years ago when people were first confronted with it. But I think it's almost unarguable. It's there's no other explanation that makes sense.
Well, we have to bring up Yogananda, and I remember when I was on a motorcycle trip back, I would say around 1974, I had autobiography of a yogi in my backpack, and I won't go into a long story about that, but it's interesting that that as I read your part in the book about him, almost like he was maybe the kind of the origin of the wellness industry in terms of his
excellent point. Yeah.
His new thought and his physical training was combined with self-hypnosis, and they were starting to market yoga as a modern cure for stress.
Exactly.
As a cure for modern stress.
And yet he came from, he had this traditional guru.
Oh, yeah.
And his brother his brother was the teacher of Bikram. So, it's incredibly tangled webs of cross-cultural influence again. So he comes with this sort of, very traditional Indian perspective to the United States, trying to promote yoga practice. Eventually, Autobiography of a Yogi is kind of ghostwritten by some of his students with all these Christian references in there to try and say yoga isn't as alien as you think. And a lot of what he was drawing on was sort of related to this tradition of New Thought, which was basically a Western attempt to popularize ideas about Eastern spirituality, going right back to where we started about the sort of underlying energetic basis of all existence from which everything emanates, going back to the Atharva Veda saying breath is Lord of all. So it's a very, very, very difficult history to unravel, I think, and almost impossible to do so. And I think it's humbling in that sense, and it's also healthy to acknowledge the extent to which we're bound up in these threads, and trying to get too Puritan about either saying what is and isn't yoga or who isn't culturally appropriating it. It's just leading to confusion. It's not how the world works, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'd like to get to that point a little bit more. But let's bring up a few more names before we move into that topic. Is Sri Aurobindo. Yeah. And his integral yoga. I actually read him back in college, and he made a big impact on me. And I was in Calcutta in 2006 and went by his ashram, and actually got a weird hit as I walked by it. It was like some strange feeling, emanation or something, but that's another story.
Well, I'd say I had a similar reaction to going to Auroville, the sort of intentional community that his followers constructed down in Tamil Nadu. It's a very strange place. I mean, it has the same vibe to a lot of spiritual hangouts, a little bit of a sort of glassy-eyed wonder of sort of I tend to. I mean, this is my base instinctive response to these things. I'll regret saying it as soon as I go there, but it reminds me of many other strange subcultures in a way. And I don't really see the great difference between that sort of spiritual community and sort of recreational drug taking in a rave. It's a similar way of getting a sense of communality, a high, and yet at the same time, it doesn't seem to transform everybody. That's really what I was struck by. I saw a lot of forlorn-looking people, a lot of Westerners who are hanging out in India, been there a long time, and they haven't found the magic answer. And that just made me a bit sad, really. Which I guess is the case everywhere. Not many enlightened people around, but one would hope that this stuff was worth having. It would create this sort of army of wonderful people spreading love and joy everywhere.
Yeah, it may be a case of looking for knowledge in all the wrong places too. But
yeah. And I don't wish to, if anybody's listening and they've been to Auroville and they've found wonderful things there, I'm sorry, perhaps the fault was mine. It's often said you see things as you are. Perhaps I was feeling despondent. But
in the previous episode, I interviewed Andrea Jain on her new book, Peace, Love, and Yoga, The Global Politics of Spirituality. And I pressed her on this very contested issue of claims to authenticity, and you have a section in your book about authenticity versus utility, but she takes a very strong stand as a scholar to not adjudicate or take sides as to what is authentic and what is not, and I think you do that too. And she views claims of authenticity as basically a power play, and that the more constructive question is to ask who's being excluded from such practices. And so are you okay with beer yoga and rage yoga? I think I could actually go for rage yoga. But when you mentioned silent...
Your palms together, you stick your middle finger up and just let it all out.
But when you mentioned silent disco yoga, I said, well, I don't know. I have never heard of that one.
Yeah, I mean, my take on all of this is, I mean, I think I differ from Andrea in that, I'm a practitioner. She's not. She's got a
Right.
critical scholarly perspective on this stuff, and is looking at it really to a certain extent from the outside, and for other reasons, as a sort of combination of political theory and anthropology. Sort of looking at what people get up to and analysing its impact. And I think in that sense, I agree with her. I do think the function of trying to police authenticity is to exert power and to construct hierarchies of power. And as she points out, who gets excluded from that is basically the people who aren't deemed on the inside. However, from the insider perspective of practice, I think all of that misses the point to a certain extent. It's irrelevant. If we're going around fixated on what other people are doing, that's not very constructive from the point of view of yoga practice or meditation practice. It's not to suggest we should have no concern for the outside world either, but from the actual point of view of the practice discipline, one's supposed to turn inwards and focus on oneself, or ultimately, ideally, transcending oneself, or at least its limited fixation on all of this craving and aversion and ill will that emanates from those things. So, primarily, I'm interested in what's useful to that end for myself. And I think, it's up to everybody to figure out for themselves what's useful. If people really find that, silent disco yoga takes them beyond a mistaken identification with this body and the contents of this mind, then good for them. It doesn't work for me. I just dance, which is nice. There's no harm in dancing, but why call that yoga? And so I think there's an interesting question to be asked about what isn't yoga for oneself, just from the point of view of needn't bother with that, not helpful for my practice. However, then beyond all of that, there's what's going on in the world. And I agree with Andrea, there's all manner of injustice that we should be concerned about. But I guess I disagree with her from the point of view of the analysis of yoga's role in that. Yoga is just another thing that people do, and they can perhaps through their practice become better skilled at navigating the problems of the world and do something about it. But there's no reason that yoga should be allied with any particular political philosophy either. And that's a new version of authenticity in my view. It's another attempt to construct a shouldn't dichotomy.
Uh-huh. Yeah, because you do bring up some issues around how some recent innovations are advocating for merging yoga with trauma therapy or social justice and creating safe spaces and all that stuff.
Well, again, all those things are potentially very beneficial and to be encouraged if people wish to do them. But what I think is to be discouraged is the generalization out of that into a philosophy of if you're not doing this, you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
And that's just the recreation of the problem, unfortunately, disguised as a solution. In fact, it's what Andrea Jain would call a gestural subversion, but never mind.
Oh, yeah. I like the quote on page 188, and you say there's the notion of a pure and unadulterated yoga is illusory, but then you also go on to say later that it's very wise to engage with tradition before going freestyle. I think that's a really nice balance.
Thank you. Yeah. My aim in writing this book was, first of all, as I explained, to write the book that I wished I'd been able to read when I was confused and unable to find a good one. But secondly, I teach yoga philosophy in all sorts of contexts, primarily at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. And, in that setting, obviously the clue is in the title. It's embedded in a fairly traditional reading of traditional texts, although commendably open-mindedly. And I speak in that context very much about the cross-pollination of all sorts of different things that aren't exclusively Hindu in the influence that's had on how yoga has developed. But I've always been interested in looking to the traditions. I think we should probably pluralize it really of yoga to see what's of benefit. They've been passed down for a reason. There is wisdom encoded in these texts. And just because we might want to leave some of them out or not take on board their entire philosophy wholesale or effectively try to shoehorn ourselves into the worldview of an Iron Age ascetic, it doesn't mean there's nothing of value in there. So I guess as somebody said before in another conversation, talking about it, the book is, it's a periodic table of the elements of yoga. So there's a sort of 100 bits and pieces that have been combined in different compounds over the centuries. And if we're honest with ourselves, whatever we do, we're going to mix our own compound. That's just the nature of reality. We're here now doing stuff with material. The problem is a lot of people mix their own compound and then say that's what's in the ancient text. And I guess what I wanted to do was to try and make it easier to be clear about what these traditional texts say, so that it also holds up the possibility of mixing and matching, but then being honest about the mixing and matching. And of course, my book's not the definitive word on anything, but I guess it's if it gives people anything, I guess it would, I hope, give them the sense of freedom to make their own way with yoga traditions, and at the same time the sense of a certain responsibility, if they want to call what they're doing yoga, to have some awareness of what's been called yoga before and to see how they relate to that, even if it's only one small aspect of it. Otherwise, why call it yoga?
Right. And I think I wrote about this in a Salon article, but I quote Charles Mingus, who is a very famous bass player, and he said, "You can't improvise out of nothing. You have to improvise out of something."
Absolutely.
And I think that's kind of having a respect and dialogue with tradition in order to improvise. I mean, as a musician, you can't just start grabbing a guitar and just hitting the strings and thinking you're going to be playing some really beautiful music. You have to learn the scales. You have to learn solos of previous performers, basic structures. So it seems that's kind of what you're advocating in a way.
I think that jazz metaphor really spoke to me. I have a good friend who's he's a former Buddhist monk, and I met him in India when we were both engaged in intensive practice of Iyengar yoga, or self-flagellation by the Ganges, and we got chatting about a lot of things. He used to be a bassist in a jazz band, and before he got into a lot of Buddhist practice, he now lives in Bangkok. If he's listening, hello, Eugene. But he got me thinking about jazz, and and the sophistication involved in the freestyling, and the fact that it's not just making it up as you go along. And that's
right. There's a lot of misconceptions of what improvisation means and what it entails. Mm. Well, Daniel, I think this is a good place to come to a close, and I want to thank you so much for sharing your research, your scholarship, your common sense wisdom about this complex historical tradition called yoga. And we've been discussing with Daniel Simpson his new book, The Truth of Yoga, published by North Point Press. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ron. It's been a real pleasure to chat, and I hope we can meet up again, whether it's in a hotel lobby or somewhere a little bit more inspiring.
I plan on heading to the UK as soon as it's possible to do so. So we will definitely see each other soon.
Sounds good. Great. Well, I look forward to it.
Okay.
Thanks again.